But you know, as Christians, there's a bigger picture than that again. Because as individual believers and as a fellowship, as the Church of Jesus Christ, in this land in which we're living and across the world, there are traps being set and we are facing oppression on all sides. I mentioned in the Bible study on Thursday evening about a Canadian pastor who had been arrested just this past week for preaching the gospel. And a summons was issued for him. And he handed himself in to the police for questioning when the summons was issued. And when he did that, he was arrested. And he was chained, handcuffed, ankle cuffs. And he was charged. And the condition of his freedom is that he ceases to preach. Now, that's not happening in a place that we would consider to be actively persecuting Christians. We have spent years, and rightly so, praying for those in eastern lands who have been persecuted, and we talk about the persecuted church. But this isn't happening in eastern lands. This is happening in Canada. This is happening in the Western world. It's happening somewhere where we wouldn't have imagined it. And as God's people, do we really understand how rapidly this could come to our doorstep? Do we grasp the reality of that? How things can move so quickly? I read a statement by Costi Hinn. Now, Costi Hinn is the nephew of Benny Hinn. I wouldn't recommend anybody ever listening to Benny Hinn, but Costi Hinn's not like his uncle. He's a believer. And he would speak much against the type of teaching that his uncle would promote. Costi Hinn wrote this in response to the arrest. And as I read these words, I thought to myself, these things are going to ring true very soon for us as God's people. He said this. He said, one day in the Western world, perhaps sooner than we ever think, preachers will be jailed and churches shut down for preaching the biblical view on marriage, for preaching the biblical view on gender. He said this will of course also be done for the good of public health and safety. And while what's happening now and the circumstances we find ourselves in, we can understand the issue with regards to people's health and safety. The reality of it is that this pastor has been told, you cannot preach again. You're not permitted to preach again for the good of public health and safety. How soon it comes before they say, you can't preach that message. You can't preach this message. You can't preach the other message. Do we grasp that that could happen? Do we understand the reality of that? We have seen signs of this in our own country in other ways. We have witnessed, and we can think back to circumstances in our own land in these past few years. We can think back to the Asher's Baking Company case. We can think about everything that went on there. And that was a scheme. Let's not misunderstand it. That was a scheme to approach a Christian young company and make a request which was against their beliefs, and the family was put through a trial for their faith. Now here's the point. Was God out of control in that circumstance? Of course he wasn't. God was still in control. And God was with that family every step of the way, and that family, those people will testify to that fact. But let's look around at what's happening in our land even since then. We have increasingly ungodly laws being passed. Same-sex marriage. Abortion. How soon will it be before we're told that we can't preach against those sorts of things in our churches? Secularism's on the rise. And there's pressure upon God's people to conform to these things. Think about equality legislation, diversity training in the workplace, and how we're all being squeezed into that mold in the workplace. And I remember it from being in the public sector, and how it was mandatory to attend diversity training, and you had to sign and say that you had attended the diversity training, so that if ever you did anything or said anything afterwards, that they could say, we told you. But going back even a number of years, I asked the question, well, what about if I happen to be preaching in a church and I make a statement and it's shared on social media or it's shared here or there, and the human resources staff couldn't tell me whether that would impact upon my employment or not? And that's going back a number of years now. The reality of it is these things are all happening for a reason. But here's the important point when we come to Psalm 91 and verse 3. He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler. Whatever we might face in life as believers, whatever tests come our way, whatever traps are laid for the believer, the Lord will still be in control of it all. The Lord still knows all about it, and the Lord will deliver those of His children who are resting under the shadow of the Almighty from the snare of the enemy. He'll deliver us in His will and in His time.